The morning air at Fort Harrison carried the scent of diesel fuel and fresh-cut grass. But Captain Elena Vasquez could taste something else entirely, the metallic tang of tension that settled on her tongue like copper pennies. He stood at attention. In formation hall, her combat boots planted firmly on the polished concrete floor. At 28 years old with 6 years of military service, Captain Elena Vasquez watched as 300 soldiers arranged themselves in perfect rows before the elevated platform where Colonel Marcus Brennan would soon deliver his weekly address, creating. Stories like this take significant time and effort. If you're enjoying this story, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. Elena's fingers unconsciously traced the worn leather of her grandfather's rosary beads, tucked deep in her left breast pocket, a habit she'd carried since basic training 8 years ago. The beads had belonged to Sergeant Major Miguel Vasquez, a man who'd served 3 tours in Vietnam and taught his granddaughter that true strength wasn't measured by how hard you could hit, but by how much you could endure while standing for what was right. Those same beads had pressed against her heart during her first deployment in Afghanistan. During the night she'd pulled 6 wounded soldiers from a burning Humvee, and during the ceremony where she'd received her Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds. That still ached when storms rolled across the Texas plains. The formation buzzed with nervous energy. To Elena's left stood Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a communications specialist whose hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her uniform jacket. Sarah had been at Fort Harrison for only 3 months, but already she'd confided to Elena about the colonel's special briefings, private meetings, where his voice dropped to a whisper and his eyes lingered too long, where questions about her personal life felt more like interrogations than casual conversation. To Elena's right, Sergeant Michael Torres shifted his weight from foot to foot, his jaw clenched tight. Michael had witnessed something last week, something that made him slam his fist against his barracks wall hard enough to leave knuckle-shaped dents in the drywall. Something he couldn't bring himself to report through official channels, because who would believe an enlisted man's word against a colonel's reputation? The hall itself held decades of military history within its walls. Black and white photographs lined the eastern wall, showing generations of soldiers who had trained at Fort Harrison, their faces frozen in time beneath the unforgiving Texas sun. The smell of floor wax mixed with the lingering aroma of coffee from the mess hall next door, creating an oddly domestic scent that contrasted sharply with the martial atmosphere. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh white light that seemed to bleach the color from the world, making every face appear pale and drawn. Elena's mind drifted to the conversation she'd had with Staff Sergeant Jennifer Rodriguez just 3 days earlier. Rodriguez had approached her after evening chow, her usually confident demeanor replaced by something fragile and uncertain. They'd walked to the motor pool, where the hulking shapes of armored vehicles provided privacy and the rumble of distant generators masked their voices. Jennifer had spoken in halting sentences about a training exercise that had gone wrong, about orders that made no tactical sense, about a colonel who'd gotten too close during a supposed equipment inspection. Her voice had cracked when she described how Brennan's breath had felt hot against her neck as he'd whispered that some soldiers needed additional motivation to reach their full potential. The heavy doors at the rear of the formation hall creaked open, and the low murmur of conversation died instantly. Colonel Brennan strode through the entrance with the practiced authority of a man who'd never questioned his right to command. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his graying hair cut in a precise military fade, his uniform pressed to razor-sharp creases. At 52, he commanded respect through a combination of legitimate military achievements, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and 28 years of service and an intimidation factor that seemed to radiate from him like heat from asphalt. On a summer day, as Brennan walked toward the platform, Elena noticed the subtle changes in posture throughout the formation. Some soldiers stood straighter, squaring their shoulders and lifting their chins in genuine respect for his rank and service record. but others seemed to shrink inward, their eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, their breathing shallow and controlled. Elena had learned to read these signs over her years of service, the way fear manifests in the human body when fight-or-flight responses war against military discipline. The colonel's polished boots clicked against the floor in a steady rhythm. As he climbed the 3 steps to the platform, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no, who'd spent nearly 3 decades in an institution where his word was quite literally law for the soldiers under his command. His eyes swept across the formation like a searchlight, and Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach when his gaze lingered on the female soldiers scattered throughout the ranks. "Good morning, soldiers," Brennan's voice boomed across the hall, amplified by the excellent acoustics that had been engineered into the space decades earlier. The collective response of "Good morning, sir," echoed back with military precision, but Elena detected an underlying tension in the voices around her, a brittleness that suggested cracks in the facade of unit cohesion. Brennan began his prepared remarks about upcoming training exercises and deployment schedules, but Elena found herself studying his mannerisms instead of listening to his words. She watched the way his left hand clenched and unclenched at his side when he spoke about discipline and order. She noticed how his voice took on a different quality when he addressed the section of the formation where most of the female soldiers stood, softer in volume but somehow more menacing in tone. Like velvet wrapped around steel dot, the morning sunlight streaming through the high windows caught the dust motes floating in the air, creating shafts of gold that seemed almost ethereal against the harsh military environment. Elena found herself thinking about her grandmother's kitchen back in San Antonio, where similar beams of light had illuminated countless family gatherings, where the smell of homemade tortillas and her abuela's perfume had created a sanctuary of warmth and safety. The contrast with her current surroundings felt almost surreal. How could the same sun that had blessed her childhood memories now seem to highlight the shadows and hidden corners where predators might lurk? A sudden change in Brennan's tone snapped Elena's attention back to the present. He was no longer reading from his prepared notes but speaking extemporaneously, his voice carrying an edge that made several soldiers visibly tense. "Some of you," he said, his eyes again scanning the female soldiers in the formation, "seem to think that wearing the uniform grants you special privileges, that your particular circumstances entitle you to different treatment or special consideration." Elena felt the rosary beads press against her chest as her breathing deepened. She'd heard this rhetoric before, the coded language that military predators used to isolate and demean their targets. The implication that female soldiers were somehow less capable, less committed, less deserving of respect and equal treatment. It was a poison that had infected military culture for generations, creating an environment where abuse could flourish under the guise of maintaining discipline and standards. Lieutenant Chun's breathing beside her became audibly shallow, and Elena could see her hands beginning to shake more noticeably. On her other side, Sergeant Torres's jaw muscles flexed rhythmically, his nostrils flaring with barely controlled anger. Throughout the formation, Elena could sense the ripple effect of Brennan's words, some soldiers nodding in agreement with what they perceived as a call for higher standards, others recognizing the toxic undercurrent and feeling their own memories of harassment or assault begin to surface. The colonel's voice rose as he continued his impromptu sermon about military bearing and proper conduct, but his eyes kept returning to specific individuals in the formation, always women, Elena noted, and always those who had shown excellence in their military specialties. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had consistently scored expert on her marksmanship qualifications. Lieutenant Chun, whose communications expertise had earned her commendations from Brigade Command. Specialist Maria Santos, whose mechanical aptitude had kept their motor pool running at peak efficiency, even during the most challenging training exercises. Elena's fingers found the rosary beads again, and she thought about her grandfather's stories of leadership during wartime. He had spoken about officers who inspired their troops through example and sacrifice, who created bonds of trust and mutual respect that could withstand the crucible of combat. He had also warned her about the other kind, those who used their rank as a weapon, who confused fear with respect and mistook compliance born of intimidation for genuine military discipline. The formation hall seemed to grow warmer as Brennan's speech continued, the morning sun now streaming directly through the eastern windows and heating the concrete floor beneath their feet. Elena could smell the mixture of sweat and nervous tension that emanated from 300 soldiers forced to stand motionless while listening to veiled threats, disguised as military instruction. The fluorescent lights hummed more loudly, creating an almost hypnotic drone that seemed to amplify the surreal quality of the moment. As Brennan's voice reached a crescendo, Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold. His right hand had moved to rest on the grip of his sidearm, not in any overtly threatening gesture, but in a casual, almost unconscious motion that spoke of comfort with the idea of using physical force to maintain his authority. It was a subtle display of power that would be meaningless to most observers, but carried profound implications for those who understood the psychology of abuse and intimidation. The colonel's eyes swept across the formation one final time, and Elena felt a chill run down her spine when his gaze locked onto hers. For a moment that felt like an eternity, they stared at each other across the expanse of the formation hall. Predator and protector, corruption and integrity, the old guard and the new generation. In that instant, Elena realized that a confrontation was inevitable, that the careful balance of silence and complicity that had allowed Brennan's behavior to continue unchecked was about to shift dramatically. Brennan's smile was cold and calculating as he concluded his remarks. But Elena could see something else flickering behind his eyes, a recognition that Captain Elena Vasquez represented a threat to the carefully constructed system of fear and intimidation he had built around himself. She was a decorated combat veteran with an impeccable service record, someone whose credibility couldn't be easily dismissed or undermined. More importantly, she was someone who had survived actual combat and wouldn't be intimidated by the artificial dangers created by a predator in uniform. As the formation was dismissed and soldiers began filing out of the hall, Elena remained at attention for a moment longer, her eyes still locked with Brennan's. The message passed between them without words. She knew what he was, and he knew that she knew. The question that hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire was simple. What would each of them do with that knowledge? The rosary beads pressed against her heart as Elena finally turned to leave, and she could almost hear her grandfather's voice whispering across the years, "Mia, there comes a time when silence becomes complicity, when standing by becomes standing with the oppressor. When that moment comes, you'll know what to do." Elena's quarters in the bachelor officer quarters felt more like a monastery cell than a home, and that was exactly how she preferred it. The single room contained only the essentials, a narrow bed with military-issue blankets folded to precise specifications, a small desk where she wrote letters to her family every Sunday evening, a metal footlocker that held her personal belongings, and a window that looked out over the training fields where soldiers practiced combat formations in the pre-dawn darkness. The morning after Brennan's speech, Elena sat on the edge of her bed at 0430 hours, 30 minutes before reveille, holding a photograph that had traveled with her through 3 deployments. The image showed her grandfather in his dress uniform, standing beside her at her commissioning ceremony 4 years earlier. His weathered hands rested on her shoulders, and his eyes, the same dark brown eyes she saw in her own mirror, radiated a quiet pride that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her military career. Miguel Vasquez had died 6 months after that photograph was taken, succumbing to lung cancer that the VA doctors said was connected to Agent Orange exposure during his tours in Vietnam. But before he died, He had shared stories that Elena carried like sacred texts in her memory. Stories about Lieutenant William Calley and the My Lai massacre, about the importance of moral courage in the face of institutional pressure, about the difference between following orders and following conscience. The hardest battles aren't fought against the enemy in front of you, Mia, he had whispered during one of their last conversations in the sterile hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and impending death. They're fought against the enemy that wears the same uniform, that sits at the same table, that claims to fight for the same flag. Those battles will test everything you believe about honor and duty. Elena's daily routine at Fort Harrison had become a carefully choreographed dance designed to minimize contact with Colonel Brennan while maximizing her effectiveness as an officer and protector of her soldiers. She rose before dawn to run the perimeter of the base, her boots pounding against asphalt that was still cool from the Texas night. The physical exertion helped clear her mind and prepare her for the psychological challenges that each day brought. Her runs, Elena often encountered other early risers soldiers who, like her, seemed to find solace in the quiet hours before the base came fully alive. Some were insomniacs haunted by combat memories. Others were simply dedicated professionals who used the morning solitude to center themselves before facing the demands of military life. But Elena had noticed a pattern. Many of the women on base had adopted similar schedules, unconsciously seeking safety in the darkness and relative isolation of the early morning hours. After her run, Elena would shower in the communal facilities, always checking the stalls and entrances with the tactical awareness that had kept her alive in Afghanistan. She had learned to read the subtle signs of predatory behavior, the way certain male soldiers timed their own visits to coincide with female soldiers' routines, the way conversations stopped when women entered communal spaces, the way some officers found excuses to conduct inspections of female quarters with suspicious frequency. Elena's job as a logistics officer required her to coordinate supply chains and transportation for the entire base, work that kept her in constant contact with soldiers from every unit and specialty. It was through this network of professional relationships that she had begun to piece together the pattern of Brennan's behavior. A casual comment from a motor pool sergeant about the colonel's special interest in female mechanics. A nervous laugh from a communications specialist about late-night equipment checks that seemed to serve no operational purpose. A supply clerk's reluctance to work overnight shifts when certain officers were on duty. The evidence accumulated like sediment in a riverbed, individually insignificant, collectively damning. Elena kept detailed notes in a personal journal that she stored in her footlocker, using a code system she had developed during her intelligence training. Names, dates, locations, witnesses, all documented with the precision of a criminal investigator building a case. But she also knew that documentation alone wouldn't be enough to bring down a colonel with nearly 3 decades of service and powerful connections throughout the military hierarchy. Elena's emotional state during this period was a complex mixture of righteous anger and tactical patience. She had learned in combat that premature action could be more dangerous than careful inaction, that timing was often the difference between success and catastrophe. But the waiting was taking its toll, manifesting in sleepless nights when she stared at the ceiling and imagined confronting Brennan directly, in moments of distraction during meetings when her mind wandered to scenarios of justice and retribution. Her relationship with her family back in San Antonio became increasingly strained as Elena struggled to maintain the facade of normalcy during their weekly phone calls. Her mother, Rosa Vasquez, possessed the intuitive awareness that many military mothers develop, an ability to detect distress in her children's voices despite their best efforts to hide it. "Mia, you sound tired," she would say during their Sunday evening conversations. "Are you taking care of yourself? Are you eating enough? Is everything okay at the base?" Elena's standard response was always some variation of, "Everything's fine, Mama, just busy with training exercises and paperwork." But the lies felt like acid in her throat, and she knew that her mother wasn't fooled by the cheerful tone she forced into her voice. Rosa Vasquez had been married to a career soldier for 32 years before Miguel's retirement. She understood the peculiar stresses of military life and the way that institutional pressures could transform good people into hollow versions of themselves. During one particularly difficult phone call, Elena's younger sister Carmen had grabbed the phone and demanded answers with the directness that only family members can employ. "Elena, what's wrong? And don't give me that everything's fine bullshit. I can hear it in your voice, and Mom's been worried sick for weeks. Did something happen? Are you in danger?" The temptation to confess everything had been almost overwhelming. Elena had stood in her quarters with tears streaming down her face, wanting desperately to unburden herself to the people who loved her unconditionally. But she also knew that sharing the truth would accomplish nothing except transferring her pain to her family, who would be powerless to help her from hundreds of miles away. Elena's dreams during this period became increasingly vivid and disturbing. She would find herself back in Afghanistan, but instead of Taliban fighters, she was facing Colonel Brennan across a dusty compound while her soldiers, her responsibility, her people cowered behind makeshift barriers. In these dreams, Brennan wore the uniform of an American officer, but spoke with the voice of every predator who had ever used power to victimize the innocent. She would wake up with her heart pounding and her sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of desert sand and fear filling her mouth. The psychological pressure of maintaining her cover while gathering evidence began to manifest in physical symptoms that Elena recognized from her combat deployments. Hypervigilance that made her jump at unexpected sounds. Chronic tension headaches that no amount of ibuprofen could touch. A loss of appetite that had her friends commenting on her weight loss. Most troubling was the way she found herself constantly scanning for exits and potential weapons in every room. She entered behaviors that had served her well in combat zones, but felt pathological in the supposed safety of an American military base. Elena's faith, which had sustained her through previous challenges, became both a source of comfort and internal conflict during this period. She attended Mass at the base chapel every Sunday, sitting in the same pew where she had prayed for strength before her deployments and for the souls of comrades who hadn't returned home. But now her prayers were more complex, fraught with questions about justice and moral courage that had no easy answers. The base chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, was a kind man in his 60s who had served as a military chaplain for over 20 years. He had a gift for reading the spiritual distress of his congregation, and Elena knew that her internal struggle was becoming visible despite her efforts to maintain professional composure. After one Sunday service, Father O'Brien had approached her with gentle concern. "Captain, you seem to be carrying a heavy burden lately. If you ever need someone to talk to in confidence, of course my door is always open." His eyes were kind but perceptive, and Elena sensed that he too might be aware of problems within the command structure that official channels weren't addressing. Elena's response had been non-committal but grateful. "Thank you, Father. I'll keep that in mind." But as she walked away from the chapel, she found herself wondering how many other soldiers might be struggling with similar moral dilemmas. How many good people were trapped between their duty to the institution and their obligation to protect the innocent. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late October, when Elena was working late in her office reviewing supply manifests for an upcoming training exercise. The building was mostly empty, with only a skeleton crew of duty personnel maintaining security and communications. Elena had been so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice the approaching footsteps in the hallway until her office door opened without a knock. Colonel Brennan stood in the doorway, his uniform slightly disheveled and his eyes carrying the glassy sheen that suggested he had been drinking. The smell of bourbon wafted into the room, mixing unpleasantly with the scent of his cologne and the underlying mustiness of the old building. Elena felt every muscle in her body tense as her combat instincts kicked into high gear, her mind automatically cataloging potential weapons and escape routes. "Working late again, Captain Vasquez?" Brennan's voice was slightly slurred, but his tone carried the same predatory undertone that Elena had learned to recognize. He stepped into the office and closed the door behind him, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet building. Elena stood slowly, her hand instinctively moving toward the desk drawer where she kept a tactical pen, a seemingly innocuous writing instrument that could serve as a weapon if necessary. "Yes, sir. Just finishing up some logistics reports for next week's exercise." Her voice was steady and professional, but internally she was running through combat scenarios and calculating angles of attack. Brennan moved closer to her desk, his eyes roaming over her uniform in a way that made Elena's skin crawl. "You know, Captain, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding unit cohesion and military bearing. I think you and I need to have a more private discussion about your role in maintaining discipline among the female soldiers." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, their meaning unmistakable despite the careful phrasing. Elena felt her grandfather's rosary beads press against her chest with each heartbeat, and she could almost hear his voice whispering the lessons he had taught her about courage and moral responsibility. This was the moment he had prepared her for, the moment when silence would become complicity, when standing by would become standing with the oppressor. "I think our current communication channels are adequate, sir," Elena replied, her voice carrying a subtle but unmistakable edge. "If you have concerns about any aspect of my performance or my soldiers' conduct, I'm happy to address them through proper military channels." Brennan's expression darkened, and Elena saw his right hand move instinctively toward his sidearm, the same gesture she had observed during his formation speech. The implied threat was clear: submit to his will, or face the consequences of defying a superior officer. It was a calculation that had probably worked countless times before, with soldiers who were younger, less experienced, or more vulnerable to institutional retaliation. But Elena Vasquez was none of those things. She was a combat veteran who had faced down Taliban fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan, a trained officer who understood both the legitimate uses of military authority and its criminal abuses. Most importantly, she was Miguel Vasquez's granddaughter, raised on stories of moral courage and trained to recognize the moment when compromise becomes collaboration with evil. "Colonel," Elena said, her voice now carrying the full authority of her rank and experience, "I think this conversation is inappropriate and should end now. If you have official business to discuss, we can schedule a meeting during regular duty hours with appropriate witnesses present." The silence that followed felt electric with tension and possibility. Elena could see the calculation happening behind Brennan's eyes, the weighing of risk versus reward, the assessment of whether she could be intimidated or neutralized. In that moment, she realized that her response would determine not only her own fate, but potentially the fate of every female soldier under Brennan's command. The rosary beads pressed against her heart, and Elena made her choice: the confrontation. In Elena's office marked the beginning of what military historians would later describe as a systematic campaign of institutional retaliation. But to Elena, living through it day by day, it felt more like slow-motion psychological warfare, each incident carefully calibrated to stay just below the threshold that would trigger formal investigation, while systematically destroying her credibility and mental health. Colonel Brennan's first move came the following Monday morning, when Elena arrived at her office to find that her security clearance had been temporarily suspended pending routine review. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Rodriguez, who served as the security officer's assistant, delivered the news with obvious discomfort, her eyes unable to meet Elena's as she explained that the suspension meant Elena could no longer access classified logistics reports essential to her job function. "How long is this review supposed to take?" Elena asked, though she already suspected the answer would be deliberately vague. The colonel said it could be anywhere from 2 weeks to several months, depending on the thoroughness required, Rodriguez replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Captain. I know this makes your job almost impossible. Elena nodded, slowly recognizing the tactical brilliance of Brennan's opening gambit. By attacking her professional capabilities rather than making direct personal threats, he was forcing her into a defensive position while maintaining plausible deniability. Any complaint she filed would sound like a disgruntled officer making excuses for her own performance failures. The security clearance suspension was followed by a series of increasingly petty but cumulatively devastating administrative actions. Elena's requests for training courses were denied without explanation. Her recommendations for soldiers under her command were returned, with demands for additional justification that seemed to multiply exponentially. A single paragraph recommendation would come back requiring 3 pages of supporting documentation, which would then be rejected for formatting violations or minor procedural errors. Most insidiously, Brennan began scheduling Elena for duties that were technically within his authority, but clearly designed to isolate her from the soldiers who might support her. Instead of her normal logistics responsibilities, she found herself assigned to inventory duty in remote storage facilities, conducting equipment inspections in locations where she would work alone for hours at a time, or supervising late training exercises that kept her away from the main base during normal duty hours. The psychological impact of this isolation campaign became apparent during Elena's interactions with other soldiers, many of whom began displaying the nervous energy of people caught between loyalty and self-preservation. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who had confided her concerns about Brennan's behavior just weeks earlier, now avoided eye contact during their brief encounters in the mess hall or administrative buildings. When Elena tried to engage her in conversation, Chen's responses were monosyllabic, and she found excuses to leave quickly. Sergeant Michael Torres exhibited different, but equally telling behavior. His earlier anger about Brennan's conduct had been replaced by a kind of defeated resignation, and Elena noticed that he had begun drinking more heavily during off-duty hours. The motor pool where Torres worked buzzed with rumors about Elena's security clearance problems, and Elena could sense the way her professional difficulties were being interpreted as evidence that challenging authority led inevitably to career suicide. Elena's most painful discovery during this period was how quickly institutional pressure could transform allies into neutral bystanders or even active collaborators. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had initially seemed sympathetic to Elena's situation, began displaying the telltale signs of someone who had been given a choice between loyalty and survival. Their interactions became increasingly formal and distant, and Elena noticed that Rodriguez always seemed to have witnesses present when they spoke insurance against future accusations of conspiracy or insubordination. The campaign of retaliation escalated significantly when Elena received her first formal counseling session, a document that would become part of her permanent military record. The session was conducted by Major Patricia Hendricks, Brennan's executive officer, who had served under him for 3 years and clearly understood which side of the conflict offered better prospects for career advancement. The counseling took place in a sterile conference room that smelled of industrial carpet and stale coffee. Major Hendricks sat across from Elena at a metal table, reading from a prepared script that detailed Elena's alleged performance deficiencies with the mechanical precision of someone who had written similar documents many times before. Captain Vasquez, this counseling session is being conducted to address concerns about your recent job performance and military bearing, Hendricks began, her voice carrying no warmth but also no personal animosity, simply the cool professionalism of an officer following orders. Specifically, there have been reports of insubordination, failure to follow proper procedures, and difficulty adapting to command guidance. Elena listened to the litany of charges with growing amazement at their creative interpretation of recent events. Her request for clarification about the security clearance suspension was characterized as challenging lawful orders. Her attempts to maintain normal professional relationships with female soldiers were described as formation of unauthorized social networks that undermine unit cohesion. Even her habit of working late hours, previously viewed as dedication, was now presented as evidence of inability to manage time effectively during normal duty hours. Each accusation was technically defensible within the broad latitude that military regulations gave commanding officers to evaluate their subordinates. But taken together, they painted a picture of an officer who was at best incompetent and at worst actively dangerous to unit morale and effectiveness. Elena realized that she was witnessing a masterclass in bureaucratic warfare, the systematic use of legitimate administrative processes to achieve illegitimate personal goals. "Do you have any response to these concerns, Captain?" Major Hendricks asked when she finished reading the charges. Elena had prepared for this moment during the sleepless nights when she stared at her ceiling and imagined various scenarios for defending herself. She could deny the charges directly, but that would simply be her word against Brennan's carefully constructed paper trail. She could request witnesses to testify about her actual performance, but most of the soldiers who could support her had already demonstrated their unwillingness to risk their own careers. She could demand a formal investigation, but that would require evidence she didn't yet have, and faith in a system that was clearly designed to protect senior officers from embarrassing accusations. Instead, Elena chose a different approach, one that her grandfather had taught her during their conversations about Vietnam and the moral complexities of military service. She decided to force her accusers to be explicit about their real motivations while creating a record that might prove valuable in future proceedings. "Major, I believe these accusations stem from a fundamental disagreement about leadership philosophy and the proper treatment of soldiers under our command," Elena said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I'm committed to maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct and protecting all soldiers from harassment or abuse, regardless of their gender or rank. If that commitment is being characterized as insubordination or poor performance, then I think we need to examine the values that are driving these evaluations." Major Hendricks's pen stopped moving across her notepad, and Elena could see the woman's mental calculations as she tried to determine whether Elena's response contained any direct challenges to authority that could be used against her. The careful phrasing had been deliberate. Elena was stating her position in terms of military values and professional responsibility, rather than making specific accusations against Brennan. "Captain, your personal opinions about leadership philosophy are not relevant to this counseling session," Hendricks replied after a moment. "The question is whether you can adapt your behavior to meet the expectations of your commanding officer and contribute positively to unit mission readiness." The subtext was unmistakable: submit to Brennan's authority completely, or face escalating consequences that would ultimately destroy her military career. Elena felt her grandfather's rosary beads against her chest and remembered his stories about officers who had faced similar moments of choice during wartime. Some had chosen survival and spent the rest of their lives knowing they had abandoned their principles when tested. Others had chosen principle and paid prices that included court-martial, imprisonment, and professional ruin. But Elena also remembered her grandfather's most important lesson: that moral courage was not a single dramatic act, but a series of small choices made consistently over time, even when the cost was high and the outcome uncertain. She had already made her choice in Brennan's office that night, and now she was simply following the logical consequences of that decision. "Major, I understand the expectations that have been communicated to me," Elena said carefully. "I also understand my obligations as a commissioned officer to uphold the values of the United States Army and protect the soldiers under my command. I will continue to fulfill those obligations to the best of my ability. The counseling session concluded with Elena's signature on documents that she knew would be used to justify increasingly severe disciplinary actions. As she walked back to her quarters through the hot Texas afternoon, Elena realized that she had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. She was now officially in open resistance to a superior officer, documented and vulnerable, with no clear path to victory and every likelihood of professional destruction. That evening, Elena sat in her quarters and composed a letter to her grandfather's memory, a practice she had maintained since his death as a way of working through moral and professional challenges. Writing to him helped her clarify her thoughts and reminded her of the principles that had guided her throughout her military career. "Abuelo," she wrote, "I think I understand now what you meant about the hardest battles being fought against enemies who wear the same uniform. I'm facing one of those battles now, and I'm scared. Not scared of dying, I've been shot at enough times to know I can handle that. I'm scared of becoming someone you wouldn't recognize, someone who chose safety over principle when the test came." The letter continued for several pages, Elena pouring out her fears and frustrations while also working through the tactical and strategic challenges she faced. Writing to her grandfather helped her recognize that her situation, while personally devastating, was also an opportunity to protect other soldiers who didn't have her advantages of rank, experience, and family support. As Elena sealed the letter in an envelope that she would never mail, she made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her life and the lives of everyone at Fort Harrison. She would not simply endure Brennan's retaliation campaign and hope for rescue from higher authorities who had shown no interest in addressing systemic problems. Instead, she would go on the offensive, gathering evidence and building alliances while forcing Brennan to escalate his attacks to a level that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. The next morning brought news that confirmed Elena's assessment of her situation. During the 060 formation, Colonel Brennan announced that Captain Elena Vasquez had been selected for special assignment duties that would require her to work more closely with the command staff on sensitive personnel matters. The announcement was delivered with the same tone used for routine administrative updates, but Elena could see the reactions throughout the formation, the nervous glances, the subtle shift in posture that indicated everyone understood the real meaning of Brennan's words. After the formation was dismissed, Elena was approached by Specialist Maria Santos, the mechanic whose expertise had kept the motor pool running efficiently despite chronic equipment problems. Santos was a tough woman in her mid-20s who had grown up in East Los Angeles and joined the Army to escape a cycle of poverty and limited opportunities. She had earned Elena's respect through her technical competence and her quiet leadership among the enlisted soldiers. "Captain, can I speak with you privately?" Santos asked, her voice carrying an urgency that made Elena immediately alert. They walked to a secluded area behind the maintenance bay, where the sound of diesel engines and power tools would mask their conversation. Santos glanced around nervously before beginning to speak, and Elena could see the internal struggle between fear and moral obligation playing out across her features. "Ma'am, I know about your situation with the colonel," Santos said, her voice barely audible above the mechanical noise. "And I know why it's happening. There are things going on that you need to know about, things that affect more than just you. But if I tell you, I'm probably going to end up just like you or worse." Elena felt a surge of hope mixed with dread. Here was potentially the witness she needed, someone who had observed Brennan's behavior directly and was willing to speak out. But she also recognized the enormous risk that Santos would be taking and the responsibility that Elena would bear for the consequences of that choice. "Maria, I won't lie to you about the risks," Elena said. "But I also won't ask you to stay silent while other people get hurt. Whatever you've seen, whatever you know, the decision to speak up has to be yours. I can tell you that I'm committed to seeing this through, regardless of the personal cost." But you have to decide if you can live with staying silent." Santos was quiet for a long moment, staring at the oil-stained concrete beneath their feet. When she looked up, Elena saw the same expression she had observed in combat veterans making life-or-death decisions, a mixture of fear and determination that came from recognizing that some lines, once crossed, changed everything. 3 weeks ago, the colonel came to the motor pool around 2,100 hours. Santos began, her voice gaining strength as she committed to her course of action. Said he needed to inspect some equipment that had been reported as potentially unsafe, but there was no report, ma'am. I would have known about it. And the equipment he wanted to inspect was in the back storage area where we keep the parts that aren't currently being used. Elena felt her stomach tighten as she recognized the familiar pattern of predatory behavior, the creation of isolated opportunities, the use of official pretenses to mask personal agendas. "Were you alone in the motor pool?" "Yes, ma'am." "And that's not normal either. Usually when officers come by for inspections, they coordinate with the day shift supervisors. But the colonel specifically requested that I stay late to show him around. Said it was important for senior leadership to understand our operations from the ground up." Santos's voice carried the bitter edge of someone who had trusted institutional authority and been betrayed by it. "What happened during this inspection?" Santos's hands clenched into fists as she continued her account. At first, it seemed legitimate. He asked good questions about maintenance procedures and equipment reliability. But then we got to the storage area, and his whole demeanor changed. He started asking personal questions about my family back home, about whether I had a boyfriend, about how I was adjusting to military life. And he kept getting closer until he was standing right behind me while I was showing him some engine parts. Elena could visualize the scene with perfect clarity, having heard similar stories from female soldiers throughout her career. The gradual escalation from professional to personal, the use of physical space as a form of intimidation, the careful testing of boundaries to determine how much resistance the victim would offer. "Did he touch you?" He put his hand on my shoulder and said I was doing excellent work, that soldiers like me were the backbone of the army, but his hand stayed there too long, and when I tried to step away, he moved with me. Then he said something about how important it was for me to maintain good relationships with the command staff, how my career could really take off if I showed the right kind of dedication. The implications were unmistakable, and Elena felt the familiar surge of rage that had sustained her through combat, but now threatened to overwhelm her tactical thinking. She forced herself to focus on gathering information rather than planning retribution. How did the encounter end? I heard voices in the main bay. Some of the night security patrol was making their rounds. The colonel stepped back immediately and switched back to talking about equipment maintenance like nothing had happened. But before he left, he made sure I understood that our conversation was confidential, that discussing personnel matters with other soldiers could be considered a breach of security protocols. Elena recognized the sophisticated nature of Brennan's approach. By framing his threats in terms of legitimate military regulations, he was creating psychological barriers that would make victims less likely to report his behavior and more likely to blame themselves for misunderstanding his intentions. "Maria, have you heard about similar incidents from other soldiers?" Santos nodded grimly. "There's a whole network of us, ma'am. We don't talk about it openly, but we know. Specialist Jennifer Martinez from Communications, Corporal Lisa Thompson from Supply, Private First Class Ashley Williams from the Orderly Room. All of them have stories about late-night inspections, special assignments, private meetings that left them feeling like they'd been violated, even when nothing technically illegal happened." The scope of Brennan's predatory behavior was becoming clear, and Elena realized that she was dealing with a systematic pattern of abuse rather than isolated incidents. The colonel had created an environment where female soldiers lived in constant fear of harassment while being systematically isolated from potential sources of support and protection. Why hasn't anyone reported this through official channels? Santos's laugh was bitter and devoid of humor. Ma'am, with all due respect, you're asking that question while you're being destroyed for challenging the colonel about something completely different. What do you think would happen to an enlisted soldier who accused a colonel of sexual harassment? Especially when he's been careful not to cross any lines that would constitute criminal behavior under the Uniform Code of Military Justice? Elena recognized the tactical brilliance of Brennan's approach. By keeping his behavior just below the threshold of criminal activity, he had created a situation where victims would face enormous risks for reporting conduct that could be dismissed as misunderstandings or personality conflicts. The power differential between a colonel and enlisted soldiers made the risks even more extreme. Careers could be destroyed with a few negative evaluations, and the military's institutional culture of protecting senior officers made successful prosecutions extremely unlikely. Maria, I need you to understand something, Elena said, choosing her words carefully. What you've described is absolutely harassment, even if it doesn't rise to the level of criminal assault. And the pattern you've identified suggests that Colonel Brennan is using his position to systematically intimidate and exploit female soldiers. That's not acceptable, and it's not something we can ignore just because it's difficult to prosecute. Santos studied Elena's face with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to read people's motivations through hard experience. Captain, I believe you mean that, but what can you actually do about it? You're one officer against the entire command structure, and they're already destroying your career for asking questions. How is speaking up going to help any of us if it just gets you was all transferred or discharged? The question struck at the heart of Elena's moral dilemma. She had committed herself to fighting Brennan's abuse, but she couldn't guarantee that her resistance would actually protect the soldiers she was trying to help. In fact, there was a significant possibility that her efforts would simply make their situations worse by provoking increased retaliation from the colonel and his allies. But Elena also knew that silence and complicity were not viable options. Her grandfather's lessons about moral courage had emphasized that the fight for justice was valuable in itself, regardless of the immediate outcome. Sometimes the most important victories were the ones that established precedents for future battles, that showed other potential victims that resistance was possible even when the odds were overwhelming. Maria, I can't promise that speaking up will immediately solve these problems, Elena said honestly. But I can promise that staying silent will guarantee they continue. And I can promise that if you decide to trust me with your story, I will do everything in my power to make sure it's heard by people who can take action. Santos was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with a decision that could alter the course of her military career and potentially her entire life. Elena respected the magnitude of that choice and waited patiently, knowing that any pressure from her would be counterproductive and potentially unethical. Finally, Santos straightened her shoulders with the decisive movement of a soldier who had chosen her battlefield. Captain, what do you need from me? The alliance between Elena and Santos marked the beginning of a new phase in the conflict at Fort Harrison. Over the following weeks, they developed a careful system for gathering evidence and building a network of potential witnesses while avoiding detection by Brennan and his supporters. Elena's experience with intelligence operations in Afghanistan proved invaluable as they created communication protocols and security measures designed to protect their sources while documenting the scope of the colonel's abusive behavior. The evidence they gathered painted a disturbing picture of systematic harassment that had been ongoing for months, possibly years. Brennan had developed a sophisticated understanding of military regulations and procedures that allowed him to exploit female soldiers while maintaining plausible deniability for his actions. He targeted soldiers who were isolated or vulnerable, those new to the base, those from disadvantaged backgrounds, those whose military specialties required them to work in small groups or alone. The pattern of his behavior was consistent across victims. Initial contact would be framed in terms of legitimate military business equipment inspections, performance evaluations, special assignments. But the encounters would gradually shift to personal territory, with inappropriate questions about relationships, comments about physical appearance, and the creation of isolated situations where harassment could occur without witnesses. Most insidiously, Brennan had created a culture of fear that extended beyond his direct victims. Female soldiers throughout the base had learned to modify their behavior in response to the threat he represented, avoiding certain locations during off-duty hours, ensuring they were never alone in buildings where he might be present, declining opportunities for advancement that would require closer contact with the command staff. Elena's documentation of this pattern was meticulous and damning, but she also recognized that evidence alone would not be sufficient to bring down a senior officer with powerful institutional protection. She needed a catalyst, a moment when Brennan's behavior would become so egregious in public that the military hierarchy would be forced to take action regardless of their preference for protecting the institution's reputation. That catalyst came during the third week of November, when Colonel Brennan made the mistake that would ultimately destroy his career and vindicate Elena's resistance. The mistake came not from a calculated escalation of his harassment campaign, but from his growing frustration with Elena's refusal to be intimidated and his increasing reliance on alcohol to manage the stress of maintaining his elaborate deception. The confrontation began during the weekly commander's formation, where Brennan traditionally addressed the entire base about training schedules, policy changes, and military matters. But on this particular morning, his prepared remarks quickly devolved into a rambling critique of certain officers who were allegedly undermining unit cohesion through their failure to support command decisions. Elena stood at attention in her assigned position, listening as Brennan's comments became increasingly personal and specific. He spoke about officers who confused political correctness with military effectiveness, who prioritized personal agendas over mission accomplishment, who failed to understand that the military was not a social experiment designed to validate civilian sensibilities. The coded language was transparent to anyone familiar with military euphemisms for challenging diversity and inclusion efforts. But Elena also detected something new in Brennan's tone, a barely controlled anger that suggested his careful facade of professional competence was beginning to crack under the pressure of maintaining his complex web of abuse and retaliation. As Brennan's speech continued, Elena noticed subtle changes in the formation around her. Some soldiers shifted uncomfortably as they recognized the inappropriate nature of his comments. Others maintained rigid attention, but Elena could see tension in their posture that indicated they were aware they were witnessing something that violated professional norms. Most significantly, she noticed that several of the female soldiers whom Santos had identified as harassment victims were showing signs of genuine distress, shallow breathing, trembling hands, the thousand-yard stare that soldiers developed when they were trying to mentally escape from intolerable situations. The breaking point came when Brennan concluded his prepared remarks and opened the floor for questions, a routine part of these formations that usually involved clarifications about training schedules or administrative procedures. But instead of the expected logistical queries, Lieutenant Sarah Chen raised her hand with a question that would change everything. "Sir, could you clarify the Army's current policies regarding equal opportunity and the prevention of sexual harassment?" Chen's voice was steady, but Elena could hear the underlying tension of someone who was taking an enormous risk. "Some soldiers have expressed confusion about the proper procedures for reporting inappropriate conduct, and I want to make sure everyone understands their rights and responsibilities." The silence that followed Chen's question was electric with tension and possibility. Elena could see Brennan's face redden as he processed the implications of what had just happened. Direct challenge to his authority disguised as a routine policy clarification. delivered in front of 300 witnesses, who would remember every word of his response. Brennan's reaction exceeded even Elena's worst expectations for how badly he might handle the situation. Instead of providing a professional response about military policies, he launched into a personal attack on Chen that revealed the depth of his contempt for female soldiers and his growing inability to control his predatory impulses. Lieutenant Chen, your question reveals exactly the kind of attitude that undermines military effectiveness. Brennan snarled, his voice carrying across the formation hall with unmistakable venom. Instead of focusing on your military duties, you're obsessing over perceived slights and imaginary grievances. This is precisely the kind of thinking that turns professional soldiers into victims looking for reasons to be offended. Elena felt her grandfather's rosary beads press against her chest as she realized that Brennan was providing exactly the kind of public demonstration of his character that would be impossible for higher authorities to ignore or dismiss. But she also recognized that his response was traumatizing Chen and potentially other soldiers who were witnessing his verbal assault. Brennan continued his attack, his voice rising with each sentence. The military is not your college campus. Lieutenant, we don't have safe spaces or trigger warnings or sensitivity training designed to protect your feelings. We have missions to accomplish and enemies to defeat, and that requires soldiers who can function under pressure without running to the nearest authority figure every time someone hurts their feelings. The formation remained frozen at attention, but Elena could sense the collective shock and discomfort rippling through the ranks. Many soldiers were witnessing their commanding officer engage in exactly the kind of unprofessional conduct that military regulations were designed to prevent. More importantly, they were seeing a clear demonstration of the hostile environment that female soldiers faced when they attempted to seek help through official channels. Elena made her decision in that moment, knowing that her next action would either vindicate her months of resistance or result in her immediate arrest and court-martial. She could not stand by and watch Brennan publicly abuse Lieutenant Chen. While 300 soldiers learned that speaking up about harassment would result in professional humiliation and retaliation. Sir, I believe Lieutenant Chen's question was entirely appropriate and deserves a professional response. Elena's voice cut through the formation hall like a blade, clear and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The words hung in the air for a moment that felt like an eternity. 300 soldiers frozen in perfect attention while processing what they had just witnessed, a captain directly challenging a colonel in front of the entire base. Colonel Brennan's head snapped toward Elena with the predatory focus of a hunter who had just identified his primary target. His face was flushed with alcohol and rage, his carefully maintained facade of military professionalism completely abandoned in favor of raw, vindictive anger. Elena could see the calculation behind his eyes as he recognized that his months of careful psychological warfare had failed to break her, and that she was now forcing him into exactly the kind of public confrontation he had tried to avoid. Captain Vasquez. Brennan's voice carried the dangerous quiet of a man who was about to unleash years of accumulated frustration and contempt. You are out of line. Return to attention immediately, or face the consequences of your insubordination. Elena remained standing, her posture erect but relaxed, her hands at her sides in a position that would allow for quick defensive movement if necessary. She had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, running through scenarios and calculating the tactical advantages of forcing Brennan to reveal his true character in front of witnesses who could not be intimidated or silenced. Sir, with respect, I believe it is inappropriate to publicly berate an officer for asking a legitimate question about military policy. Elena replied, her voice carrying across the formation hall with the authority of someone who had faced enemy fire and emerged stronger. Lieutenant Chen's question about equal opportunity and harassment prevention policies was entirely within the scope of information that all soldiers should understand clearly. The formation around Elena seemed to hold its collective breath as they witnessed an unprecedented breakdown in military hierarchy and discipline. Some soldiers remained rigidly at attention, trained by years of military conditioning to follow orders regardless of the circumstances. But others were beginning to show subtle signs of choosing sides, slight shifts in posture, meaningful glances exchanged between trusted friends, the kind of nonverbal communication that develops within tight-knit military units. Elena could see Lieutenant Chen's face from the corner of her eye, pale with shock but also something that might have been gratitude or hope. Specialist Santos, standing in the enlisted ranks, maintained perfect military bearing, but Elena caught the almost imperceptible nod of support that passed between them. Throughout the formation, Elena sensed the presence of the network they had built over the preceding week. Soldiers who had witnessed Brennan's abuse, who had suffered under his intimidation, who were waiting to see if resistance to his authority was truly possible. Colonel Brennan took 3 steps toward Elena, closing the distance between them in a way that violated every principle of professional conduct and appropriate use of military authority. His hand moved to rest on the grip of his sidearm, not drawing the weapon, but making sure that everyone present understood the implicit threat underlying his words. "Captain, you have forgotten your place in this command structure," Brennan said, his voice now carrying the cold menace that Elena had heard during their private encounter in her office. "You seem to think that your personal opinions about leadership and military culture give you the right to challenge direct orders and undermine military discipline. That stops now." Elena felt her grandfather's rosary beads against her chest, and remembered his stories about moments when institutional pressure demanded compromise with evil. She thought about Lieutenant Chen, trembling but still standing at attention after being publicly humiliated for asking a legitimate question. She thought about Specialist Santos and the network of female soldiers who had been systematically terrorized by a predator in uniform. She thought about all the soldiers throughout military history who had faced similar moments of choice between personal safety and moral courage. "Colonel, I have not forgotten my place," Elena said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "My place is as a commissioned officer sworn to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, to lead soldiers with integrity and respect, and to uphold the values that make military service honorable. That includes protecting soldiers from harassment and abuse, regardless of the rank of the person perpetrating it." The accusation was now explicit and undeniable, delivered in front of 300 witnesses who would remember every word for the rest of their military careers. Elena had crossed the line from subtle resistance to direct challenge, forcing Brennan to either back down in public humiliation or escalate to a level that would make his behavior impossible for higher authorities to ignore. Brennan's response exceeded even Elena's expectations for catastrophic miscalculation. Instead of attempting to de-escalate the situation or restore some semblance of professional decorum, he allowed his rage and alcohol-impaired judgment to drive him toward the kind of spectacular self-destruction that would end his career and validate everything Elena had been saying about his character. "You sanctimonious bitch," Brennan snarled, his voice carrying across the formation hall with unmistakable venom. "You think you can destroy my career with your feminist bullshit and your accusations about harassment. You think these soldiers care about your college-educated opinions about military culture?" The profanity and personal attack in front of the entire formation crossed multiple lines simultaneously: professional conduct, military regulations, and basic human decency. Elena could sense the collective shock rippling through the assembled soldiers as they witnessed their commanding officer abandon any pretense of military bearing or leadership competence. But Brennan was not finished. The months of psychological pressure, the frustration of failing to break Elena's resistance, and the growing threat to his carefully constructed system of abuse had finally overwhelmed his ability to maintain the facade of respectable authority. He took another step toward Elena, his hand now gripping his sidearm in a gesture that was unmistakably threatening. "You want to protect these soldiers?" Brennan said, his voice rising to a near shout that echoed off the walls of the formation. "Hall, let me show you what protection looks like in the real military, not your politically correct fantasy version." Elena saw Brennan's hand beginning to draw his sidearm and reacted with the combat-trained reflexes that had kept her alive in Afghanistan. But instead of drawing her own weapon or taking defensive cover, she did something that would be remembered and discussed in military leadership courses for decades to come. She stepped forward toward Brennan, closing the distance between them to arm's length, and spoke in a voice that carried absolute authority and zero fear. "Colonel, you are relieving yourself of command through conduct unbecoming an officer. I am placing you under citizen's arrest for threatening a fellow officer with a deadly weapon in front of witnesses." The formation hall erupted into controlled chaos as Elena's declaration processed through 300 military minds simultaneously. Soldiers trained to follow orders found themselves witnessing the complete breakdown of their command structure, with a captain arresting a colonel while both officers stood in front of them with sidearms at their belts and emotions running at dangerous levels. Brennan's hand completed its motion toward his weapon, but Elena had anticipated the movement and was already inside his reach, her left hand controlling his gun arm while her right hand moved to a pressure point on his wrist that would force him to release his grip. The techniques she employed were precisely what she had learned in military police training and combat situations: efficient, overwhelming, and designed to neutralize threats with minimal injury to all parties involved. The physical confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds. Elena's superior training, sobriety, and tactical preparation overwhelmed Brennan's rage-impaired reactions, and she had his sidearm secured and his arm controlled before he fully understood what was happening. But those 10 seconds contained enough dramatic action and clear-cut moral positions to provide unambiguous evidence about the character and competence of both officers involved. "Colonel Brennan, you are disarmed and under arrest," Elena announced, her voice carrying across the formation hall with professional calm, despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Sergeant Major Williams, please secure the colonel's weapon and call the military police. All soldiers will remain at attention until the situation is resolved." Sergeant Major Robert Williams, a career soldier with 26 years of service, found himself in the impossible position of witnessing his commanding officer being disarmed by a subordinate in front of the entire base. But Williams was also a professional who understood that Elena's actions had been defensive and proportionate, and that Brennan's behavior had violated multiple military regulations and criminal statutes. "Yes, ma'am," Williams replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had decided which side of history he wanted to be on. He moved quickly to secure Brennan's weapon while other senior, non-commissioned officers began the process of maintaining order and discipline among the formation. The next 30 minutes played out like a carefully choreographed military exercise, with each participant understanding their role in the larger drama that was unfolding. Military police arrived within minutes, having been alerted by soldiers who had witnessed the confrontation and recognized the need for official intervention. Base security officers secured the scene and began taking statements from witnesses, while medical personnel evaluated both Brennan and Elena for injuries related to their physical altercation. Throughout this process, Elena maintained her composure and professional demeanor, cooperating fully with investigators while also making sure that her version of events was clearly documented. She had anticipated this moment for weeks and had prepared detailed, written statements about Brennan's pattern of harassment and abuse, along with supporting evidence from the network of soldiers who had witnessed his behavior. Colonel Brennan, meanwhile, seemed to cycle through different stages of psychological response to the catastrophic end of his military career. Initially, he attempted to reassert his authority, demanding that Elena be arrested for assault and insubordination. But as the military police explained the charges that would likely be filed against him, assault with a deadly weapon, conduct unbecoming an officer, harassment, and violation of equal opportunity policies, his bluster gave way to a kind of shell-shocked recognition of the magnitude of his situation. The investigation that followed, Elena's dramatic confrontation with Colonel Brennan, unfolded with the methodical thoroughness that characterized serious military inquiries. Within hours of the Formation Hall incident, investigators from the Criminal Investigation Division had arrived at Fort Harrison to begin documenting what would eventually become one of the most significant cases of military sexual harassment and abuse of authority in recent Army history. Elena's careful documentation of Brennan's behavior patterns proved invaluable to investigators who might otherwise have struggled to establish the systematic nature of his misconduct. The journal she had kept, written in code and stored in her secured footlocker, provided dates, times, locations, and witness information that allowed investigators to quickly corroborate her allegations through independent sources. More importantly, Elena's public confrontation with Brennan had created an environment where other victims felt safe to come forward with their own accounts of harassment and abuse. Specialist Santos was among the first to provide detailed testimony, describing not only her own encounters with Brennan, but also the informal network of female soldiers who had developed strategies for avoiding his predatory attention. Lieutenant Chen, whose question about harassment policies had triggered the final confrontation, provided investigators with evidence of Brennan's retaliation against soldiers who sought help through official channels. Her testimony revealed that she had previously attempted to report inappropriate conduct through her chain of command, only to be told that her concerns were misunderstandings that could damage her career if she pursued them further. The scope of Brennan's misconduct became clearer as more soldiers agreed to speak with investigators. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had initially distanced herself from Elena to protect her own career, now provided detailed accounts of how Brennan had used his authority to create opportunities for harassment while systematically intimidating potential witnesses into silence. Perhaps most damaging to Brennan's case was the testimony of Major Patricia Hendricks, his executive officer, who eventually admitted that she had been aware of allegations against Brennan but had chosen not to report them up the chain of command. Hendricks's testimony revealed the institutional pressures that allowed predatory behavior to continue, unchecked career concerns, loyalty to fellow officers, and a military culture that prioritized avoiding scandal over protecting victims. Investigation also uncovered evidence of Brennan's alcohol abuse, which had contributed to his increasingly poor judgment and erratic behavior. Military police found multiple bottles of bourbon in his office and quarters, and medical examination revealed blood alcohol levels that exceeded military standards during duty hours. This evidence provided additional context for his spectacular loss of control during the Formation Hall confrontation. Elena's role in the investigation was complex and sometimes uncomfortable. While she was clearly the victim of retaliation and harassment, she was also the arresting officer who had used physical force against a superior officer. Military prosecutors had to carefully navigate the legal and procedural challenges of a case where traditional hierarchical relationships had broken down so completely. But Elena's military record, combined with witness testimony about Brennan's threatening behavior, ultimately supported her claim of self-defense and citizen's arrest. Video surveillance from the Formation Hall confirmed that Brennan had initiated the physical confrontation by attempting to draw his weapon, and that Elena's response had been proportionate and professionally executed. The broader implications of the case extended far beyond the individual careers of Elena and Brennan. Fort Harrison became the subject of a comprehensive investigation into command climate and equal opportunity policies, with inspectors examining every aspect of how the base had been managed during Brennan's tenure. The results painted a picture of systematic dysfunction that had allowed predatory behavior to flourish while discouraging victims from seeking help. Elena's confrontation with Brennan also sparked discussions throughout the military about leadership, moral courage, and the proper response to abuse of authority. Her actions were studied in military academies and leadership courses as an example of how junior officers could uphold military values even when senior officers failed in their responsibilities. But the personal cost to Elena was significant and ongoing. While she was ultimately vindicated by the investigation and praised for her moral courage, the months of psychological warfare had taken their toll on her mental and physical health. She struggled with insomnia, hypervigilance, and a persistent sense of being isolated from her peers, symptoms that military psychologists recognized as consistent with prolonged exposure to institutional trauma, the rosary beads that had sustained Elena throughout her ordeal became even more precious to her during the investigation period. She often held them while giving testimony or reviewing evidence, drawing strength from the connection to her grandfather and his lessons about moral courage. The beads had witnessed her grandfather's service in Vietnam, her own deployments in Afghanistan, and now this battle against an enemy who wore the same uniform and claimed to serve the same values. Elena's family back in San Antonio followed the investigation through news reports and official communications, finally understanding the source of the stress and exhaustion they had detected in her voice during their weekly phone calls. Her mother, Rosa, flew to Fort Harrison to provide emotional support during the most difficult phases of the investigation, and Elena found herself able to speak openly about her experiences for the first time in months. "I knew something was wrong, Mia," Rosa said during one of their conversations in Elena's quarters. "A mother knows when her child is fighting battles that shouldn't have to be fought. I'm proud of you for standing up to that man, but I'm also angry that you had to do it alone for so long." Elena's response reflected the complex emotions she had wrestled with throughout her ordeal. "Mama, I wasn't alone. I had Abuelo's lessons. And I had the soldiers who were counting on me to do the right thing. Sometimes that has to be enough, even when it doesn't feel like enough." The court-martial of Colonel Marcus Brennan took place 6 months after his dramatic removal from command, in a military courtroom filled with journalists, military officials, and soldiers whose lives had been forever changed by the events at Fort Harrison. Elena sat in the witness section, wearing her dress uniform with the ribbons and decorations that told the story of her military service: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Action Badge, and the newer edition of the Army Commendation medal she had received for her courage in confronting institutional abuse. The trial itself was a masterclass in military justice, with prosecutors methodically presenting evidence of Brennan's pattern of harassment, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Elena's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, her clear and detailed account of Brennan's behavior providing the framework that allowed other witnesses to tell their stories without fear of retaliation or disbelief. But it was the testimony of Specialist Maria Santos that provided the most emotionally powerful moment of the trial. Santos, now promoted to sergeant for her exceptional performance and moral courage, described the network of female soldiers who had lived in constant fear of harassment while being systematically isolated from sources of help and protection. Colonel Brennan created an environment where being a professional soldier wasn't enough. Santos testified, her voice steady but carrying the weight of months of suppressed trauma. "We had to be perfect soldiers and also navigate a minefield of inappropriate behavior, retaliation, and implied threats. Captain Vasquez showed us that we didn't have to accept that environment, that someone with the courage to act could change everything." The defense team's strategy relied heavily on attacking Elena's credibility and portraying Brennan as a decorated veteran, whose career had been destroyed by politically motivated accusations. But their efforts were undermined by the overwhelming evidence of systematic misconduct and the testimony of multiple witnesses who corroborated Elena's account of events. More significantly, the defense team's attempts to portray Elena as a disgruntled officer seeking revenge backfired when prosecutors presented evidence of her distinguished service record and the personal sacrifices she had made to protect other soldiers. Her grandfather's rosary beads, which she wore during her testimony, became a symbol of the moral foundation that had sustained her through months of institutional pressure and retaliation. The verdict, when it came, was comprehensive and decisive. Colonel Brennan was found guilty on multiple charges including conduct unbecoming an officer, harassment, abuse of authority, and assault. His sentence included dismissal from the Army, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and confinement for 18 months in military prison. But perhaps more importantly for Elena and the soldiers she had protected, the conviction established a clear precedent that senior officers could be held accountable for predatory behavior regardless of their rank or service record. Elena's own military career underwent a dramatic transformation in the aftermath of the Brennan case. While she had expected to face career stagnation or forced retirement as a consequence of her confrontation with a superior officer, the opposite occurred. Military leadership at the highest levels recognized that Elena represented the kind of moral courage and professional integrity that the Army needed to address systemic problems with harassment and abuse. 2 years after the Brennan trial, 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 her promotion to major came with assignment to the Pentagon, where she was tasked with developing new policies and training programs designed to prevent the kind of institutional failures that had allowed Brennan's behavior to continue unchecked. The irony was not lost on Elena. Her resistance to one colonel's abuse had positioned her to influence the entire Army's approach to leadership and accountability. The office that Elena occupied in the Pentagon was a stark contrast to her Spartan quarters at Fort Harrison. Furnished with mahogany furniture and decorated with portraits of distinguished military leaders, it represented the institutional power that she now wielded in service of protecting soldiers throughout the Army. But she kept her grandfather's rosary beads in the top drawer of her desk, a reminder of the personal values that had guided her through the darkest moments of her confrontation with Brennan. Elena's work at the Pentagon focused on 3 primary areas: policy development, training programs, and institutional culture change. The policy she helped develop strengthened reporting procedures for harassment and abuse, while providing better protection for whistleblowers and victims who came forward with allegations. The training program she designed emphasized moral courage and ethical leadership, using case studies and scenarios to prepare officers for the kinds of complex situations where institutional pressure might conflict with professional responsibility. Elena understood that the most important aspect of her work was cultural changing the underlying attitudes and assumptions that allowed predatory behavior to flourish in military environments. This required a delicate balance between respecting military traditions and values while challenging the toxic aspects of military culture that prioritized loyalty to individuals over loyalty to principles. Elena's influence extended beyond policy development into mentorship and leadership development. She became a sought-after speaker at military academies and leadership courses, sharing her experiences and lessons learned with the next generation of military officers. Her presentations were notable for their honesty about the personal costs of moral courage and the institutional challenges that officers would face when confronting abuse of authority. During one such presentation at West Point, a cadet asked Elena how she had found the strength to confront Colonel Brennan despite the obvious risks to her career and personal safety. Elena's response captured the essence of the lessons she had learned from her grandfather and refined through her own experiences. Moral courage isn't about being fearless, Elena explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had tested her principles under extreme pressure. It's about being afraid and acting according to your values anyway. It's about recognizing that some things are more important than personal safety or career advancement, the welfare of the soldiers you're sworn to protect, the integrity of the institution you serve, the kind of person you want to be when you look in the mirror. The impact of Elena's work became evident in the years following the Brennan case, as reports of harassment and abuse in the military began to decline while conviction rates for substantiated cases increased dramatically. The policy she had helped develop created clearer pathways for reporting misconduct while providing stronger protection for victims and witnesses. More importantly, the cultural changes she had advocated began to shift the institutional response to allegations of abuse, from skepticism and protection of accused officers to thorough investigation and accountability. Fort Harrison itself underwent a complete transformation under new leadership that was specifically selected for their commitment to creating a positive command climate. The base became a model for other installations, implementing comprehensive equal opportunity programs and creating support networks for soldiers who had experienced harassment or abuse. The formation hall where Elena had confronted Brennan was renamed the Vasquez Leadership Center, in recognition of her moral courage and the precedent she had established for holding senior officers accountable. Elena's personal life also evolved significantly in the years following the Brennan case. The psychological trauma of months of institutional retaliation and the stress of confronting systemic abuse had taken a significant toll on her mental and emotional health, requiring ongoing therapy and support to process the complex aftermath of her experiences. Working with military psychologists who specialized in institutional trauma, Elena learned to recognize and address the hypervigilance, trust issues, and emotional exhaustion that had accumulated during her confrontation with Brennan. The therapy sessions were challenging, requiring her to revisit painful memories and examine the ways that prolonged stress had affected her relationships and worldview. But therapy also provided Elena with tools for healing and growth that enhanced her effectiveness as a leader and advocate. She learned techniques for managing stress and maintaining emotional equilibrium during difficult situations, skills that proved invaluable in her Pentagon assignment, where she regularly dealt with sensitive cases and institutional resistance to change. Elena's romantic relationships had been complicated by her military career even before the Brennan case, but the trauma of institutional betrayal made trust and vulnerability even more challenging. She struggled with the tendency to view potential partners through the lens of tactical assessment, analyzing their motivations and potential threats rather than allowing herself to experience genuine emotional connection. It was during her second year at the Pentagon that Elena met Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a civilian psychologist who worked with the Department of Veterans Affairs on issues related to military sexual trauma. Sarah's understanding of institutional dynamics and trauma responses created a foundation for genuine connection that gradually allowed Elena to lower her emotional defenses and experience the kind of intimate relationship that had seemed impossible during the darkest periods of her confrontation with Brennan. Their relationship developed slowly and carefully, with Sarah respecting Elena's need for emotional safety while also challenging her to remain open to trust and vulnerability. Their first date was a simple dinner at a quiet restaurant in Alexandria, where they talked about books, travel, and their shared commitment to helping people heal from institutional trauma. "I've worked with a lot of military survivors," Sarah said during one of their early conversations, "and I've learned that healing isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't matter. It's about integrating those experiences into a larger story about who you are and what you value." Elena's response reflected the growth and self-awareness she had developed through therapy and reflection. "For a long time, I thought the Brennan case defined me, either as a victim or as someone who fought back. But I'm learning that it was just one chapter in a larger story about service and responsibility. The challenge is making sure the next chapters are ones I choose, rather than ones that are chosen for me. Elena's family relationships also required attention and healing in the aftermath of the Brennan case. Her mother, Rosa, had supported her throughout the investigation and trial, but Elena realized that she had inadvertently created distance from her family as a way of protecting them from the stress and danger of her situation. Rebuilding those connections required honest conversations about the costs of moral courage and the ways that institutional trauma affects not only the primary victim but their entire support network. During a visit home to San Antonio, Elena and her mother sat in the same kitchen where she had grown up, listening to her grandfather's stories about military service and moral responsibility. The afternoon light streaming through the windows carried the same golden quality that Elena remembered from her childhood, but now it illuminated a conversation between two women who had both been changed by the events at Fort Harrison. "I'm proud of what you did, Mia," Rosa said, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold during their conversation. "But I'm also angry that you had to do it. Angry that the system failed so badly that it took a captain confronting a colonel in front of 300 soldiers to make people pay attention to what was happening." Elena reached across the table and took her mother's hands, feeling the calluses and strength that came from years of hard work and dedication to family. "Mama, I think that's exactly why it was important. Not just to stop Brennan, but to show that the system can be changed when people are willing to risk everything to do what's right. Abuelo always said that courage isn't inherited, it has to be chosen fresh by each generation." The conversation continued for hours, touching on themes of sacrifice, responsibility, and the complex legacy of military service. Elena realized that her confrontation with Brennan had not only changed her own life, but it also provided her family with a deeper understanding of the moral challenges that military personnel face when institutional loyalties conflict with ethical obligations. Elena's work at the Pentagon expanded significantly as her expertise in addressing institutional trauma and abuse became more widely recognized. She was appointed to serve on multiple committees and task forces focused on military culture reform, sexual assault prevention, and leadership development. Each assignment brought new challenges and opportunities to influence policy at the highest levels of military leadership. One of her most significant achievements during this period was the development of a comprehensive training program for senior military leaders that addressed the ethical dimensions of command authority. The program, known as Command Responsibility and Moral Courage, became mandatory for all officers above the rank of lieutenant colonel and was eventually adopted by all service branches. The training program used case studies drawn from Elena's experiences and those of other officers who had confronted institutional abuse, providing participants with frameworks for recognizing and addressing ethical challenges before they escalated to crisis levels. The program emphasized the difference between loyalty to individuals and loyalty to principles, teaching officers how to navigate complex situations where personal relationships and institutional pressures might conflict with their professional and moral obligations. Elena's role as a program developer and instructor allowed her to directly influence thousands of military leaders throughout her career, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond her own service. Officers who completed her training programs carried those lessons to their own commands, creating a cascade of cultural change that gradually transformed the institutional response to harassment, abuse, and ethical violations. But Elena's most meaningful work during this period involved direct mentorship of junior officers who faced situations similar to what she had experienced at Fort Harrison. Her office became an informal sanctuary for officers who were struggling with ethical dilemmas, institutional pressure, or retaliation for speaking out against misconduct. One such officer was Lieutenant Jennifer Park, a military intelligence specialist who had uncovered evidence of financial corruption in her unit, but was facing intense pressure from her command to remain silent. Park sought Elena's guidance after receiving threats and experiencing professional retaliation that closely paralleled Elena's own experiences with Colonel Brennan. "Ma'am, I know what I witnessed was wrong," Park said during their first meeting, her voice trembling with the familiar combination of fear and determination that Elena recognized from her own journey. "But everyone is telling me that pursuing this will destroy my career, and that I should focus on being a good soldier rather than trying to police my superiors." Elena's response drew on years of experience and reflection about the nature of moral courage and professional responsibility. "Lieutenant, being a good soldier means upholding the values and standards that make military service honorable. It doesn't mean protecting people who violate those standards, regardless of their rank. The question you have to answer is whether you can live with staying silent while corruption continues, or whether your integrity requires you to accept the risks that come with speaking truth to power." Elena's mentorship of Park and dozens of other officers facing similar challenges became one of the most rewarding aspects of her Pentagon assignment. She was able to provide practical guidance about navigating institutional resistance while also offering emotional support and validation for officers who were questioning their own perceptions and judgment. The success of these mentorship relationships was measured not only in the resolution of individual cases, but in the development of a new generation of military leaders who understood that moral courage was not a luxury reserved for exceptional circumstances, but a fundamental requirement of professional military service. Elena's influence extended beyond individual mentorship into the development of institutional support systems for officers facing ethical challenges. She worked with military legal services, chaplain corps, and mental health professionals to create comprehensive networks of support that could provide assistance to officers regardless of their rank, specialty, or the nature of their ethical concerns. These support systems included confidential reporting mechanisms, peer support programs, and legal protections for whistleblowers that significantly reduced the risks associated with reporting misconduct. More importantly, they created institutional cultures where ethical concerns were viewed as opportunities for improvement rather than threats to be suppressed or marginalized. The long-term impact of Elena's work became evident through statistical measures that tracked improvements in military culture and ethical climate. Reports of harassment and abuse continued to decline while conviction rates for substantiated cases remained high, indicating that both prevention and accountability systems were functioning effectively. But Elena understood that the most important measures of success were qualitative rather than quantitative. The stories of individual soldiers who felt safe to report misconduct, the accounts of officers who found the courage to confront ethical challenges, the testimonials from military families who no longer feared that speaking up would result in retaliation and career destruction. 5 years after her confrontation with Colonel Brennan, Elena was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to command a training battalion at Fort Benning. The assignment represented a return to direct leadership of soldiers, allowing her to implement the leadership principles and cultural changes she had developed through her policy work and mentorship experiences. Her change of command ceremony was attended by many of the soldiers whose lives had been touched by her courage and advocacy, including Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, who had herself become a leader and mentor within the Army's growing community of survivors and advocates. The ceremony was held in the same type of formation hall where Elena had confronted Brennan, but the atmosphere was completely different, filled with respect, admiration, and hope rather than fear and intimidation. Elena's acceptance speech focused on the themes that had guided her throughout her career: the importance of moral courage, the responsibility of leaders to protect those they serve, and the ongoing need for vigilance against institutional failures that could allow abuse and corruption to flourish. "Leadership is not about the authority that comes with rank," Elena said, addressing an audience that included soldiers, officers, and civilians who had been inspired by her example. "It's about the responsibility that comes with the trust that others place in you. When that trust is betrayed, when authority is used to harm rather than protect, it becomes the duty of every soldier to stand up and say, "This will not continue on my watch." The ceremony concluded with Elena receiving her grandfather's rosary. Beads from her mother, who had traveled from San Antonio to witness her daughter's assumption of command. The beads had been carried through 3 generations of military service, from Miguel Vasquez's tours in Vietnam through Elena's deployments in Afghanistan and her confrontation with institutional corruption at Fort Harrison. As Elena held the beads, she could almost feel the weight of all the moral challenges that had been faced and overcome by the soldiers who had carried them before her. But she could also sense the potential for future challenges and the ongoing need for courage, integrity, and commitment to the values that made military service meaningful and honorable. The rosary beads would continue to serve as a reminder of the lessons learned and the prices paid in the service of justice and accountability. But they would also serve as a source of strength for the battles yet to come. The ongoing fight to ensure that military institutions remained worthy of the sacrifice and dedication of the soldiers who served within them. 3 years later, Elena stood before a joint session of Congress, her uniform crisp and her bearing reflecting the confidence that came from years of successful leadership and institutional reform. The hearing room was packed with journalists, military officials, and advocates who had followed her career from the dramatic confrontation at Fort Harrison through her rise to become one of the Army's most influential voices on issues of leadership, accountability, and institutional culture. The hearing was focused on proposed legislation that would strengthen protections for military whistleblowers and create independent oversight mechanisms for investigating allegations of abuse and misconduct. Elena's testimony was considered crucial because of her unique perspective as both a victim of institutional retaliation and a senior leader who had successfully implemented cultural change within military organizations. "Members of Congress," Elena began, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of speaking truth to power. 8 years ago, I was a captain stationed at Fort Harrison who witnessed systematic harassment and abuse of authority. The institutional response to my concerns taught me that courage alone is not sufficient to address systemic problems. We also need structural changes that protect people who speak up and ensure that allegations are investigated thoroughly and impartially. Elena's testimony drew on her extensive experience implementing policy changes and developing training programs, but it was grounded in the personal knowledge that came from having lived through the challenges she was describing. She spoke about the fear that prevented soldiers from reporting misconduct, the retaliation that awaited those who challenged authority, and the institutional pressures that allowed predatory behavior to continue unchecked. But Elena's testimony also highlighted the progress that had been made since her confrontation with Colonel Brennan. She presented statistics showing significant improvements in military culture, increased reporting of misconduct, and higher conviction rates for substantiated cases. More importantly, she shared stories of individual soldiers whose lives had been changed by the institutional reforms that had followed her example of moral courage. The legislation you are considering today represents the next phase in an ongoing transformation of military culture. Elena continued, her eyes moving across the faces of the congressmen and women who would vote on the proposed reforms. It builds on the foundation created by soldiers who have risked their careers to expose wrongdoing, by leaders who have chosen accountability over institutional protection, and by families who have supported their loved ones through the difficult process of challenging systemic failures. Elena's congressional testimony was broadcast live on military television networks and became required viewing at military academies and leadership courses throughout the armed forces. Her clear articulation of the challenges facing military institutions and the potential solutions offered by legislative reform provided a framework for ongoing discussions about the Relationship between military culture and democratic values. The legislation that Elena supported was passed by overwhelming majorities in both houses of Congress and signed into law by the President in a ceremony that Elena attended as a representative of the military personnel who had advocated for stronger protections and accountability measures. The law created independent inspector general offices for investigating allegations of misconduct, established legal protections for whistleblowers that were enforceable through federal courts, and required regular assessments of command climate and institutional culture. But Elena understood that legislative changes, while important, were only part of the larger transformation that was needed to address systemic problems within military institutions. The real work of cultural change continued to take place in unit formations, training exercises, leadership development programs, and countless individual interactions where soldiers learned what it meant to serve with honor and integrity. At age 37, Elena's promotion to colonel came with assignment to the Pentagon as Director of Leadership Development, a position that allowed her to influence policy and training programs throughout the Department of Defense. Her office became the institutional center for developing the next generation of military leaders, with responsibility for curricula that emphasized ethical decision-making, moral courage, and the proper use of military authority. The leadership development programs that Elena oversaw became models for military organizations throughout the world, with foreign officers traveling to the United States to study her approaches to institutional culture change and accountability. Her influence extended beyond the American military into international discussions about the role of armed forces in democratic societies and the importance of professional military ethics. Elena's personal life continued to evolve during this period, with her relationship with Sarah Mitchell deepening into a partnership that provided stability and support for the demanding work of institutional reform. They were married in a ceremony attended by soldiers whose lives had been touched by Elena's courage and advocacy, including Maria Santos, who served as Elena's maid of honor, and Lieutenant Jennifer Park, whose own career had flourished after successfully exposing the financial corruption in her unit. The wedding took place in San Antonio, in the same church where Elena's grandparents had been married decades earlier. Elena wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to accommodate her military decorations, and carried her grandfather's rosary beads as her something borrowed. The ceremony represented not only a personal milestone, but also a symbol of the integration between Elena's professional mission and her personal values. Elena and Sarah's partnership extended beyond their personal relationship into collaborative, professional work, with Sarah providing psychological expertise for military programs, addressing institutional trauma, and Elena contributing operational knowledge about military culture and leadership challenges. Their joint presentations at conferences and professional gatherings became highly sought after, offering audiences unique insights into the intersection of individual psychology and institutional dynamics. 5 years after her congressional testimony, Elena was promoted to Brigadier General, becoming one of the youngest officers to achieve that rank in recent Army history. Her promotion ceremony was attended by soldiers from throughout her career, including many of the women who had found the courage to speak out against harassment and abuse because of her example. The ceremony was held at Fort Harrison, now completely transformed from the institution where Elena had confronted Colonel Brennan over a decade earlier. The base had become a model for positive command climate and institutional accountability, with comprehensive support systems for soldiers facing ethical challenges and robust programs for preventing harassment and abuse. Elena's promotion speech addressed the themes that had defined her career: the importance of moral courage, the responsibility of leaders to protect those they serve, and the ongoing evolution of military culture toward greater accountability and respect for human dignity. "Leadership is a sacred trust," Elena said. addressing an audience that included soldiers, family members, and civilian officials who had supported military reform efforts. It requires us to put the welfare of those we serve above our own comfort, convenience, or career advancement. It demands that we have the courage to confront wrongdoing wherever we find it, regardless of the rank or position of those who perpetrate it. Elena's speech concluded with a reflection on her grandfather's influence on her understanding of military service and moral responsibility. My grandfather taught me that every generation of soldiers faces tests of character and courage that define not only their own service, but the institution they leave behind for future generations. The test of our generation has been learning to confront institutional failures while preserving the values that make military service honorable and meaningful. As Elena concluded her remarks, she touched the rosary beads that now rested in a place of honor in her uniform pocket. The beads had witnessed her grandfather's service in Vietnam, her own deployments in Afghanistan, her confrontation with Colonel Brennan, and now her rise to general officer rank. They represented continuity across generations of service while also symbolizing the evolution of military values toward greater accountability and ethical responsibility. 10 years after her promotion to general, Elena was selected to serve as superintendent of the United States Military Academy at West Point, the highest honor that could be bestowed on an officer committed to developing future military leaders. Her appointment represented recognition of her contributions to military culture reform and her unique qualifications for preparing the next generation of officers to face complex ethical challenges. Elena's tenure at West Point was marked by comprehensive reforms to the curriculum that emphasized moral reasoning, ethical leadership, and the proper use of military authority. She instituted mandatory courses on institutional accountability, created mentorship programs that connected cadets with officers who had demonstrated moral courage in challenging situations, and established support systems for cadets who faced ethical dilemmas during their development as future leaders. But Elena's most significant contribution to West Point was the example she provided of how moral courage could transform institutions and create lasting change. Her story became part of the Academy's institutional memory, taught in leadership courses and discussed in honor code training as an example of how individual actions could influence entire organizations. Elena's final assignment, before retirement, was as Commanding General of the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, where she oversaw the development of doctrine, training, and educational programs for the entire Army. Her influence extended into every aspect of military professional development, from basic training programs that emphasized respect and accountability to advanced courses for senior leaders facing complex ethical challenges. During her retirement ceremony, Elena reflected on the journey that had taken her from a young captain, confronting institutional abuse, to a senior general responsible for shaping military culture throughout the armed forces. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of soldiers whose lives had been influenced by her example, including many who had found the courage to speak out against wrongdoing because of the precedent she had established. Elena's retirement speech focused on the ongoing nature of institutional reform and the responsibility of each generation of soldiers to continue the work of cultural transformation. She emphasized that moral courage was not a destination, but a journey, requiring constant vigilance and commitment to values that transcended individual careers or institutional convenience. The work of reform is never finished, Elena said, addressing an audience that included soldiers, family members, and civilian leaders who had supported military transformation efforts. Each generation faces new challenges that test their commitment to the values that make military service meaningful. The question is not whether these challenges will come, but whether we will have the courage to meet them with integrity and determination. As Elena concluded her military career, she returned to San Antonio to care for her aging mother and to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting military families affected by institutional trauma and abuse. The foundation provided legal assistance, counseling services, and advocacy support for service members who faced retaliation for reporting misconduct or challenging abusive authority. Elena's foundation work allowed her to continue the mission that had defined her military career while also addressing the civilian dimensions of military culture reform. She worked with congressional staff on legislation, consulted with military organizations on policy development, and provided mentorship for young officers facing ethical challenges, similar to those she had confronted decades earlier. But Elena's most meaningful work during retirement involved direct support for individual families who were struggling with the aftermath of institutional betrayal and abuse. Her office became a place of refuge for military spouses, children, and extended family members who had been affected by the secondary trauma that resulted from institutional retaliation against their loved ones. Elena's work with these families provided her with a deeper understanding of the broader costs of institutional failure and the importance of comprehensive support systems that address not only the immediate victims of abuse, but also their entire support networks. This understanding informed her advocacy work and her ongoing efforts to influence military policy and culture. 20-5 years after her confrontation with Colonel Brennan, Elena was invited to speak at the dedication of the Vasquez Center for Military Ethics at Fort Harrison. The center was established to provide research, training, and support services related to military leadership, accountability, and institutional culture reform. Elena's dedication speech reflected on the faith and transformation that had occurred since her dramatic confrontation in the formation hall that now bore her name. She spoke about the progress that had been made in creating more accountable and ethical military institutions, while also acknowledging the ongoing challenges that required continued vigilance and commitment. Institutional change is measured not only in policies and procedures, but in the lives of individual soldiers who feel safe to serve with honor and integrity, Elena said, addressing an audience that included many of the soldiers whose courage had contributed to the transformation of military culture. The test of our progress is whether young soldiers today can report misconduct without fear, challenge authority when necessary without retaliation, and serve their country without compromising their personal values. As Elena concluded her speech, she held up her grandfather's rosary beads, now worn smooth by decades of handling during moments of prayer, reflection, and moral challenge. The beads represented the continuous thread connecting her grandfather's service in Vietnam to her own confrontation with institutional abuse, and to the ongoing work of cultural transformation that would be carried forward by future generations of soldiers. These beads have witnessed 3 generations of military service, Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated experience and wisdom. They have been present during moments of moral testing that define not only individual careers but the character of the institution we serve. I share them today as a reminder that courage is not inherited but chosen, that integrity is not guaranteed but earned, and that the work of justice requires the commitment of every generation to the values that make service meaningful. Elena's final public appearance was at the graduation ceremony of the West Point class that had been her last as superintendent. The ceremony represented the culmination of her life's work. Young officers prepared to face the ethical challenges of military leadership with the tools, support, and institutional culture necessary to choose courage over convenience and integrity over institutional protection. As Elena watched the new officers take their oath of service, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a young captain struggling with institutional abuse to a retired general whose influence had shaped military culture for an entire generation. The challenges she had faced and overcome had been personal, but their resolution had created systemic changes that would protect countless future soldiers from similar experiences. Elena's legacy was measured not only in the policies she had influenced, the leaders she had mentored, and the institutions she had reformed. But in the countless individual moments when soldiers chose to do the right thing because they had learned that courage was possible, that institutions could change, and that individual actions could create lasting transformation, the rosary beads that had sustained Elena throughout her journey now rested in a place of honor in her home, available to provide strength and guidance for whatever challenges might still lie ahead. They represented the continuous thread of moral courage that connected past service to future responsibility, individual actions to institutional change, and personal integrity to the larger mission of creating military institutions worthy of the sacrifice and dedication of those who serve within them. Elena's story had begun with a young captain confronting the colonel who abused his authority, but it had evolved into something much larger, a testament to the power of moral courage to transform institutions, protect the innocent, and create lasting change that extends far beyond any individual career or lifetime of service. As Elena settled into retirement, surrounded by the family, friends, and colleagues whose lives had been touched by her example, she knew that the work of institutional reform would continue in the hands of the leaders she had mentored and the systems she had helped create. The confrontation in the formation hall at Fort Harrison had been a single moment in time, but its ripple effects would continue to influence military culture for generations to come. 30 years after that fateful morning at Fort Harrison, Elena Vasquez, now retired General Vasquez, sat in her study in San Antonio, sunlight streaming through the same windows where she had once written letters to her grandfather's memory. On her desk lay a thick manila envelope that had arrived that morning, marked confidential and bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. Inside were photographs and testimonials from the latest graduating class of the Elena Vasquez Leadership Academy, a program now operating on 17 military installations worldwide. Young officers from diverse backgrounds, all trained in the principles of moral courage that had defined Elena's career, were taking their places in leadership positions throughout the armed forces. But what moved Elena most was the handwritten note tucked between the official documents. It was from Second Lieutenant Maria Santos, granddaughter of the Specialist Santos, who had first trusted Elena with her story of harassment decades earlier. The younger Maria had followed her grandmother's example into military service, but, unlike previous generations, she was entering an institution fundamentally transformed by the courage of those who had come before. General Vasquez, the note read, "My grandmother always told me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite the fear because someone else needs you to be brave. Thank you for showing us that one person really can change everything. The uniform means something different because of what you did." Elena touched her grandfather's rosary beads, now displayed in a frame alongside her military decorations. Through the window, she could see children playing in the neighborhood where she had grown up, their laughter carrying on the Texas breeze. Some of those children would grow up to serve their country, and when they did, they would enter institutions shaped by the choices made in a formation hall 3 decades earlier. The ripples of that single moment of moral courage continued to expand, touching lives not yet born, preventing injustices not yet imagined, and ensuring that future generations of soldiers would serve in an environment where speaking truth to power was not an act of extraordinary heroism, but simply the expected standard of professional conduct. Elena smiled, knowing that somewhere today, a young soldier was finding the courage to do the right thing because they had learned that change was possible, that institutions could be transformed, and that individual actions could create lasting justice. The story of courage never truly ends. It simply passes from one generation to the next, carried forward by those who refuse to let silence become complicity. Stories like this require extensive research and careful storytelling. If you're finding this compelling, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of courage.